The most stressful part about being a farmer is the uncertainty of everything. Every day is a gamble. You might get a hailstorm, you might not. You might get the rain you need, you might not. You don't know what's going to happen. Currently, between my dad and I, we farm about 4,500 acres. Things are a little tighter than normal right now. I'm looking at the markets every half hour to an hour. That's what a lot of it comes down to nowadays. It's all down to dollars and cents. Trusting your product is the biggest key to it all. When I buy product, I want to know that it's going to perform. It's all about having my NP and K right there, right where I want it. My experience with Micro Essentials has been great because I know that when I'm applying my fertilizer that it's going exactly where I want it, and every piece is the exact same. Farming is our livelihood, and this is all I've ever done. I hope I can pass it on to the next generation of my children and maybe my grandchildren someday.
Next hour, we're going to talk weather. A lot of people confuse the two. Give me your, how you explain the difference.
Really, weather is what's happening right now. What's happening tomorrow is not meteorology, it's forecast. And there's a distinction there too. And climatology is everything that happened from the beginning of this sentence to as far back in time as we go.
So your handling forecasts, everything else.
I go back, present, and future.
All right.
I go way into the future sometimes, probably farther than I should go, but that's what people want to know, so I give them my opinion.
One of the benefits that we have up in this area as farmers and anybody in agriculture, and I look at it every day, is the NDAWN maps. Give us a little history on that. How that got started? What are some of the goals of NDAWN?
I will answer that question by using myself as an example. I started at WDAY, WDAZ back in 1996, early on, as April 1st, in fact. It was always a running joke when I was there that it was an April Fool's joke that I've been here all these years, because that's my first day of employment. And when I came here, the thing that frustrated me the most was we really only had 8 reporting sites in the state. We had Fargo, Grand Forks. Go to Highway 281, we had Jamestown, and we had a report from the Devils Lake Airport. We had Bismarck, Minot, and then we had Dickinson and Williston. That's all we had. And granted, we had the 2 air bases, but they were in Minot and Grand Forks, pretty close to where we're already getting data. They really weren't of any added benefit. It was nice to have them, but we didn't have any added benefit. So in turn, where are things? We would, especially if something would come in from Lake Sakakawea, dive down to the southeast towards Fargo, as an example, they would never hit a reporting site. You wouldn't know what was going on. I always appreciated when the time I worked with Rob Kupek, when he first started with us in the early 2000s, like 2001, 2, Rob would actually call, back in the day when we had phone books, before cell phones, he would look at the phone book and call gas stations to try to find out what was going on. And you would think, well, geez, Daryl, you're a meteorologist. You don't know what's going on? No, I actually didn't. I mean, you can look at the radar, which that was in many ways pre-Doppler days still, but it still is an energy pulse coming out, an energy pulse being returned, put into colors. It doesn't see anything. It's not a real life being, as I always tell people. A tornado doesn't see tornadoes. A Doppler doesn't see tornadoes, I should say. And so it was really being blind. And I start with that in the sense is I'm thinking that John Enns, our former state climatologist, he had the vision of starting, we need weather data in the state of North Dakota, and more specifically, we need weather data in agriculture. And so back in the late 1980s, he got some grants. NDAWN technically started in 1989. I've never seen those records, but we do have data back to 1990. Well, that was mainly at the regional extension centers around the state, say Carrington, a good example of that. And so the thing is, they're all hooked up to phone lines, old phone modems, and really what would happen is after midnight, they'd be downloaded and then phone lined over and for the data. So what's happening currently, many of you may recall, eventually got to the point where you could call it up, and then you have to wait, and then, okay, that's what's going on right now type stuff. But it's very, still pretty primitive. But we had this data and this collection, and the nice thing is, okay, now we can get a more accurate count of growing degree day units, and a lot of other disease parameters came into being. Well, there was, and I forget his name off the top of my head, but there was a potato farmer up in northeastern North Dakota in 1992 that saw, wow, this is great. And so he worked with NDSU. Could we come up with a early blight modeling for potato blight? And interestingly enough, this person had a great vision. Any of you old enough remember 1993? Just a horribly wet summer. And the potato farmers credited NDAWN with saving the potato crop that year. And in turn, that got publicity, and then other people wanted them. And so NDAWN is phenomenally unique, and I can't really explain to anyone that doesn't know the background that NDAWN is unique in the sense that, yeah, now that I'm an NDSU employee, and you can call me a state employee, but our stations are all sponsored privately. And so we're this conglomeration of private and government working together to develop these tools and this stuff. And when I first came into NDAWN, we had 73 stations, which was a very good mesonet. We just installed our 155th station last week. We're going to install, we have it partially done, 156 next week. And so we've doubled in the last 6 years. That means more data, more tools. My programmer is behind, but we have this great data. And I don't say it because I'm the director right now. I was happy to change careers because I loved NDAWN. The valuable and the tools on all of that. South Dakota has a mesonet. It's only 27 stations. Minnesota really doesn't have a mesonet. The best mesonet in Minnesota is NDAWN in the northwestern part of the state. The Minnesota Department of Ag had 12 stations kind of floundering in central North Dakota. They asked if we would take them over. So if you go to our maps now, you'll notice, geez, Daryl, where do these stations come from? Those are Minnesota to try to help them out, save them money, get them online, and help them out. So that's kind of a history. So now we went from this data-starved state to probably having more weather data perhaps than any other state almost in the country. So it's been a really good turnaround, and that's why I'm proud to work within NDAWN, because NDAWN is a weather risk management tool. You can't change the weather, you can't fix the weather, but it can be managed, and you can handle your weather risk and timing your spraying, knowing when diseases are going to form, knowing where your crops are based on growing degree days, the more simple things that are out there. But all of those tools come together, and the great joy of working with NDAWN is the ability to save people money. I know when people approach me about putting in a station, investing in NDAWN, I go, my goal is you're going to give me $10, I'm hoping to give you $100 back on this. You know, I want you over the years that you're going to get a return on this investment and make more profits, make more money, do higher yields, do everything better because of NDAWN.
Are there some holes in the network where we need to fill in some stations? Would you like to see?
Well, it's interesting that I did not have a lot of stations out in western North Dakota. There's an individual out in western North Dakota that I knew through some events and different things that we're both involved with. And we were talking one day about the oil industry, and he was explaining to me how tough it is out there because everything is done on gravel roads, and they get stuck, they destroy the roads, they have to shut down, and they lose millions, his quote, millions of dollars a day in lost revenue because of this. And I go, oh, just put up a bunch of weather stations, monitor the rain, divide your counties up into zones. With smartphones, someone can program it in. This zone is closed to go around, or this rain system's coming in, get everyone off the roads. And my goodness, you could save that amount. I only have to be right one day. In the next 10 years, make your money back 50-fold. And so that was the beginning of this micronet. NDAWN's a mesonet, meso meaning middle network. Micronet, really we have stations more in the 10 kilometers, so about 6 miles. And of course, we're all familiar with township and range. That's pretty much 6 square miles. So trying to get an NDAWN station within every township. So we went now and have already installed, what are we up to, 34 NDAWN stations out in western North Dakota for the oil industry, but they're all NDAWN stations. So the same inversion app capabilities, all the ranchers, our fusarium head blight guidance for the grain growers out there are on there. And so that area now is really covered. So oddly, I really only have one big hole on my map, and it's Morton and Burleigh County. I have a station in Mandan, but nothing in Morton and Burleigh County. So Burleigh County, the second most populous county in the state, has this many, that's zero, NDAWN stations. And every time I'm invited to speak in Bismarck, if absolutely possible, I accept, because I go out there trying to get money, to get NDAWN stations in the county, and I keep failing. But this week, I'm about a whisper away now from a huge Army Corps of Engineers grant to fill in all my gaps in the upper Missouri River Basin, which is Burleigh and Morton County. So any land that flows into the Missouri, so that would include the James River as well, eventually, and out west, we'll do it. So it will take me a couple of years, but I will in turn fill in all our gaps. But we just, put a station up in Wales just a couple of weeks ago, up northwest of Langdon. It was a little dead spot. We're putting up a station. We did it last week east of Perth, which is southwest of Rock Lake, to fill in for the Devil's Lake Basin. So they have better data for what's flowing into Devil's Lake. So we still have a few gaps, but when I came in, my goal was to infill everybody in the state of North Dakota would live within 20 miles of an NDAWN station, and we're getting really close.
As you mentioned too, picking up some of the Minnesota side, that seems to be expanding as well.
Yes, now I'm getting a lot of phone calls in that area. I don't want to step on people's toes. I go, well, we could do it, but maybe you should talk with the Minnesota Department of Ag, try to build you in. My weakest link right now is programming time. All these stations, we're so used to with technology now is you push a button and magic happens. I always call it pixie dust. And that's great, but someone had to make that pixie dust for us. And so I'm behind. If you go on my website, there's 131 stations. I already told you I have 155. My programmer is now 25 behind. We just had a big update this year. We had 40 stations that have been kind of taking time to get into our system. And so right now I'm working on getting grants and monies and trying to work with the legislature and others, both again private and government, just get more programming time because there's so much, we're so data rich now. There's so many great tools that could be available not only in agriculture but all aspects of society if we can just make that pixie dust, just get programmers that can do that and get those tools online for us.
All right, very good. A little bit of history, I guess. I was for somebody that's moved into the area here over the last 10, 12, 15 years, it's fun to hear the history because it was here when I got here. And so I appreciate that. Thank you much. Let's talk. We had a little bit of a frost last week. Are we looking at more, or what's things looking like?
Really, again, it's not an everyday thing. And this is sometimes where people don't listen to me carefully. I gave a number of talks, all of them, of course, virtually. It's really nice to actually be out with people again in August and even in July, and people asked me about the fall. And I said, I really think September and October combined is going to be above average temperatures, and I still think that way. And precipitation, probably near average. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of folks are below average, but there's very likely going to be a storm system that's going to put this little streak across the region, and that is not predictable. So I don't think everyone is going to be that way. Well, here we are sitting on the 17th of September. So far this month has generally been cool. And in all those talks, I said, by me saying above average, in no way, shape, or form means we're going to have a late frost. Absolutely not. We might not. It only takes one little disturbance, something to bring in. We're always on the edge. We can have frost in these parts in August, as we remember 2004. It only takes a day or two, which unfortunately happened to us last week. But, looking the rest of this month, most areas should not see another freeze down to 32. Might see some warnings in the 30s, but probably not down to 32. It looks above average temperatures. I don't see a lot of moisture. There'll be a little system coming in on Sunday. Doesn't look like it's going to amount to much, something in the middle of next week. But below average precipitation does not mean zero. From this point through the end of October, approximately, we all average about 3 inches. So if we got 2 inches, well, if you're trying to harvest, it's going to frustrate you, but it doesn't mean that we're above average. And if I had $1 for everyone who asked me, are we going to have 2019 happen to us again this fall? I think I could take everyone in this room out for not a great lunch, but a pretty good lunch across the hand. And I reminded people, I go, I don't know the future. I'm just crazy enough to forecast it. But I will tell you that 2019 was probably the wettest autumn in the Northern Plains since 1825. Why 1825? Because 1825 was a very wet autumn. We have no records, but we have voyageurs and other individuals that were here. That was the great flood of Fort Garry up in Winnipeg. Their highest flood they ever had was in 1826. Thereafter, there were stories about just deluges of rain, massive flooding in the area. And so I said last autumn was probably what I refer to as a white bison event. And notice I said bison, not bison. But climatologists have historically used this phrase, black swan events. And I hate that phrase because there's a species of black swans. And so I'm thinking, how unusual is that? I in turn use white bison. It fits our area in some ways. If I say white bison, if I'm in a completely NDSU event, I'll use that phrase. Or if I'm speaking in South Dakota just to irritate them, which I did this past winter before COVID stopped my speaking schedule. But I go, it's really, a white buffalo per se is a very rare event. We just one passed away that we had out in Jamestown that was born. And so we have those events. The summer of 1936, that heat wave of 10 days. From July 6th through about the 16th, nothing even comes close. I mean, there's that record and then everything, nothing. And the reality is last fall was one of those events. March of 2009 for that great flood, how much rain we had. It was double the previous record. It's just, wow, it's just out there. I go, those events happen, but you don't predict those. It was last year, I think it was the Friday before Labor Day, last year, Crystal Sugar took me out to lunch. Want to talk weather, and I go, what about harvest this year? And I go, I just have the strong suspicions rain is going to be your nemesis, was the word I used to them this year. And they go, why? And I go, well, we have this happening, this happening, this happening, we have this stuff. I go, you know how it is. We have these sometimes wet falls, but we always get our harvest done here. Well, we didn't last year. Yep. But that's always Daryl's half glass full thing. Because most of the time that's true. Again, it doesn't look great, but we'll get through it type of answer. They called me, 3-4 weeks later and said, well, my goodness, Daryl. I go, oh no, don't even begin to tell me I was right. Because no way would anyone think this was going to happen, white bison and stuff. And so that's the thing with long range forecasting. You might get the generalities right on, but I really think, for the next 6 weeks through Halloween, generally above average. Most of the time, probably average or below average rain. There'll probably be a little strip in there someplace that makes me wrong, but temperature-wise looks very promising. So if your crops didn't die with the frost, sadly, last week, we'll get some extra growing degree days and drying. I tell you, one of the big flies in the proverbial honey or ointment here is the arson fires from out west. Look what happened to us on Tuesday. Last week, I go, wow, someone had asked me about 80, and I go, next Tuesday we have a great shot of hitting 80. Looks really warm, be one day, we'll cool down for a couple days, warm up again thereafter, and blah, blah, blah. And then we barely hit 70. The smoke covered everything. So I had a number of farmers call me and go, what happened? And I go, you can't forecast the smoke in advance, number one. Number two is I understand your frustration because you lost a great drying day. You lost a lot of evaporation potential. If you want now just get the crops to dry down, it really somewhat screwed you. And you should be frustrated, but, that's the joys of modern society with a bunch of arsonists, because none of them were, nature didn't start these, everyone was human started. Sure. And so it's a problem. So we have those fires out there. I don't know in the next 3 or 4 weeks. I mean, that day, temperatures were generally anywhere from 8 to 14 degrees cooler than they otherwise would have been. And how many more days we have that, could come down to, well, your corn might end up taking 5 longer days to dry, and every 5 longer days you go in our climate is closer to winter, closer to a snow. It's a cascading event, and those are the things that are really going to be unpredictable. But taking that aside, I really think the next 6 weeks, overall, nothing's perfect, but looks pretty promising.
Looks like we're seeing maybe a little bit of moisture coming into that Pacific Northwest expected in over the weekend, basically, I guess. Really,
even beyond that, the next period looks more wet for them. And I think, in my long-range forecast is the Pacific Northwest, especially west of the Cascades, will turn wet. The jet stream will be up, and a little ridge will be over the northern plains much of the next 6 weeks. Again, not every day. More often than not. And so in turn, those storms will help us trough, the jet stream sinking south over the northwest. Then in turn, the effect has to be up to the north over us. It's a very typical autumn La Nina pattern. And so then we stay dry. Eventually that shifts over, and then we'll probably trend colder once we get into November. We'll see how long it lasts, but might not last exactly to Halloween, but till the 20th or something, most of that time period. So hopefully it'll put out the fires, but it's not going to impact California, and some of our smoke is actually coming from there as well. And with that upper air pattern that way, we still might get some.
Well, we saw the maps. Looks like that smoke was reaching all the way to the East Coast.
Yes, actually reaching into Europe
Yeah.
as well.
How much of an impact does that have globally?
Globally, that's a tough one. The thing is, I always remind people that the two hemispheres don't interact. And so the northern hemisphere is one big interaction. For instance, already today I was asked about the tropics. And I go, what happens in the Atlantic basin doesn't really impact our weather in the northern plains. What happens with typhoons, which are hurricanes, in the western Pacific does, oddly. And so that's a bigger factor. I mention that because, again, the whole northern hemisphere reacts. Something that does happen in Asia does impact North Dakota or Minnesota. And then the southern hemisphere kind of interacts on its own. So that's why, globally it won't. United States, yeah, it might have a 2 or 3/10 of a degree overall impact on, say, the United States, lesser as we get into Asia. So it'd be more of that. But the thing is, odd to say, some days was, wow, we're going to get a lot of severe weather this afternoon. Not a single cloud forms. And people think, boy, those meteorologists, they get paid to be wrong. I wish I had their job. What happened? The high temperature was 88. The high temperature was 89. Then the whole atmosphere would have exploded. We would have gotten the lift we needed, exploded through a little layer cap, a little inversion layer in the atmosphere, massive thunderstorms, and we would have had widespread severe weather. Missed it by half a degree. People don't realize that, but that's important. So when you say about the smoke, I already mentioned the drying potential. We'll see how bad it continues to be. It might not impact us hardly at all the rest of the fall. It's an unknown, but that little subtle stuff does kind of add up. If we're a half a degree cooler every day because of it, you don't notice it each day, but your crops and drying time notices over the course of 15 days. So that's why it's little things end up being big things eventually.
That's what I was going to ask, because we're coming off of a year like last year where the eastern third of North Dakota, western Minnesota was so wet. We have all the soil moisture we need to, we're still got some subsoil moisture problems or issues.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and so that little teeny bit of drying might have potential to alter that just a little bit, because there are, not everyone, but there are certainly those areas and pockets that are wet, and I'm not going to be able to harvest this anytime I want. I'm going to have to wait. We'll have to wait till freeze up. And last year even that didn't help. It was so wet. So that's why subtle things do add up. And like I gave the one kind of more of an analogy is that a half a degree added up over 3 weeks does add up to something that might delay you 4 or 5 days. Well, then you would have been done. Then a snowstorm comes. You don't care. But you might not be. Those are the things why little subtle things sometimes add up.
Well, and last year, too, I think we had that snow so early that it's insulated everything. It never did freeze down, did it?
Last year was a phenomenally strange winter. Most of the state had no frost in the soil for the entire winter, or very minimal on it. We have sensors all over the state for that, and it was just remarkable. Some of our sites that are on a little bit more of a ridge, a little bit of a hill, we don't have a lot of topography, but a little bit. So then the wind kind of scours it out, and there might only been 2 or 3 inches on the ground. Yes, we got frost down to 24, 30 inches, but even that's shallow in comparison to most years. Our sensor here in Fargo never really went. I had Christmas decorations up last winter. Of course, we just got puked on with that big snowstorm right after Christmas last year, plus the one we had the last day of November. And so we had this huge stuff, so I had to dig my Christmas decorations out to take them out after Christmas. And when I was pulling the stakes that hold them in ground, every one of them just pulled out like it was summer. And then the grass under the snow was just sopping wet from all the moisture that we had. So it was very unique. The odds are, that's not going to be the case this year.
I think I had talked to you, must have been one of the farm shows, ice show, or one of those, I think it was up in Grand Forks. And you had talked about that, thinking going into spring that we were going to, because we did not freeze, that we maybe see a little earlier spring, and we did until we got the rain.
Right. And then the other thing is, the winter wasn't all that bad for temperatures. We just, unfortunately, and it's one of those long-range forecasting problems always, is that it got so cold from late April to the middle of May. It was just, even by our standards, cold. And so then that delayed that whole process, because a lot of those conversations that go, if we have an average April, and we, both rain and sunshine wise, because the ground's not frozen, we'll get that top 2 or 3 inches, would dry out quicker. And that scenario just did not quite, unfortunately, work out, but there was that possibility because of it. But it still helped us in the sense that, gravity still was pulling the water down a little bit. So, obviously it was still like a swamp for a lot of people in the spring. It would have been worse had we not had that protection all winter.
Just again, if anything we're talking about triggers a question or I'm not asking what you want to hear, just raise a hand, we'll get a microphone to you and ask a question. We talked, Daryl, you mentioned it, alluded to it, looking into our fall harvest time frame, so chances are staying fairly dry, may get that 1 to 2 inch rain sometime during this time?
Well, the thing is, again, we average 3 from this point through Halloween. So I just always tell people, if you expect something, you're not going to be disappointed. And again, if we get 2 of the 3, I don't think there's anyone in this room that's going to raise their hand, yes, Daryl, I want 2 more inches of rain. Might be somebody, but not too many. Well, the reality, you have to expect that, because we get 2 out of 3, that's only 66% of normal. That is a dry fall the next 6 weeks. But at the same time, with your saturation levels, there are reasons to believe that that we'll do much better than that going forward. And I think there's probably going to be spots that might only get 3/4 or an inch during this entire time frame. But it just would be very unusual for all of us. And the thing is, if we have an above average October for temperatures, even though it's a cold month, any month you're above average here is a little bit more potential for a little bit more moisture because of the way that the flow is. And again, it's not technically right, but it's the way it's described the most, is the warmer it is, the more capacity the atmosphere has to hold moisture. And so there's always that, and that's why my strong suspicion is we're going to at least get 1 streak at some point. Crystal Sugar had asked me this last week about my thoughts. He goes, it looks like the next 10 days look really promising. I go, it does. But, there'll be a little bit of rain on Sunday maybe, and a little bit, in the middle of next week. But right now it doesn't look bad, but there might always be the spot. But temperature-wise, yep, it looks good. And they go, well, we really want to start October 1st. And I said, you have to remember we average, about 2 inches average in your co-op, a little bit more in the south of it and a little bit more in the north. And most of that comes in the first half of October, because it's just as we go through the cold, we get drier and drier and drier. So I go, you should plan for at least 1 system that comes through with, say, 3/4 of an inch or an inch that's going to delay you, but that's all common. But just don't expect, to be perfectly dry. We've had those years, but if you expect that, you're only setting yourself up for disappointment. But again, it looks, from historical patterns, for instance, this year is very similar in many ways right now to 2005. And that was also the year we had massive amounts of hurricane in the Atlantic Basin. That year, almost all areas in the upper Midwest had a dry, warm October. But there was 1 system, and we had this little streak come through. And so that I don't use, or that's exactly going to happen. No years repeat itself, but it is a good example of this type of pattern that you should have that anticipation.
With the sugar beet crop then too, if we can get shut down because of frost, freeze, or on the other end, too high of temperatures, where are we going to sit temperature-wise?
I think, from the next 6 weeks, I would estimate we'll end up anywhere from maybe 2 or 3 degrees above average, which is still cold. It's October.
Yeah.
You have to remember on Halloween, our average high in Fargo is only 47. So if you're 3 degrees above average, it's 50. It's not that problem. And our average low on Halloween is 27, I think, or 28 in that range. And so being above average cools down, but it gives every degree that you're above average is more drying potential. And that's a good thing. And so that's, and that doesn't mean every day it's going to be 2 or 3. We're going to have another cold snap. We're going to probably have last week occur in the next 6 weeks where we're like 10, 15 degrees below average for 4 or 5 days. But as I mentioned people last week, 3 days does not make a trend.
Right. La Nina, we've been hearing more and more about that. Actually strengthening La Nina the way it looks.
Here's the thing about La Ninas. You will hear, I'm just guessing here, but I think 100% of the forecasts you hear in the next 6 weeks for the upcoming winter will be for it to be cold and snowy because there's a La Nina. Every single El Nino that we hear about, which say a couple of years ago, is it's going to be warm and dry. Here's the reality. Those El Nino forecasts for the warm and dry are only accurate about 2 out of 3 times. So 1 out of 3 years it's a complete bust. La Nina percentage of accuracy is even lower than that. We had a La Nina back in the winter of 11 and 12. Death, destruction, and mayhem were the general rules of the day for that upcoming forecast. Everyone, oh man, everything's set up. It's going to be a terrible, horrible winter in the northern plains. Some very renowned, very famous meteorologists said that. I was interviewed, and again, I'm not bragging here, folks, just telling a story. What do you think? I go, really, this isn't a La Nina like most La Ninas. I really think the winter overall is going to balance to be close to average. I'm not buying a horribly cold winter scenario. Does anyone remember 11 and 12? What actually happened? Pretty much the warmest winter on record. I had the best forecast, and I sucked by saying average. I just didn't look. And the thing is, every time you hear anything that an El Nino equals this, a La Nina equals that, or this equals anything, if that this is a single parameter, it's crap. Nothing in not one thing controls the weather ever. So one thing does not equal another in weather. It's a complex, chaotic, nonlinear system in the atmosphere. And so this upcoming La Nina, could it be a cold winter? Well, all of our winters are cold. Even that warmest one on record back in 11 and 12, or one of the warmest on records that year, by other people's standards. But I just throw that one out to you that La Ninas are even worse than El Ninos. And El Ninos, you get at least some confidence. La Ninas is more of it's a little bit better than 50-50, but a coin flip. But there is one in place. It looks like it's centered more in the Central Pacific. And if that's the case, I personally don't think it's going to be quite as bad as most of the forecasts. I'd go back to the 11-12, and I bet it ends up being a little bit closer to average, or maybe on the cold side of average a little bit for this upcoming winter. But we'll have to see really in the next 6 or 8 weeks exactly where the coldest waters and how it sets up.
Does that impact South America more than us then?
La Ninas impact Argentina and more so than Brazil. It was back the last La Nina we had. I was at a winter farm show. The La Nina was in progress. Of course, Argentina, I think it was an early ag show. Argentina being much more farther south than Brazil, planting a little bit later in the fall, had asked me about the grain markets. And I said, well, if there's one place on the planet that might have a tough season that would impact the markets, it'd be Argentina. And that year, Argentina had just a horrible soybean crop. They had to import for crushing beans, if I recall correctly. And so this La Nina, where it's placed, I would lean back to a few years ago. If someone's going to have a tough next 9 months, including our 2021 growing season, perhaps, at least in the short term, that may impact markets, I would, again, lean towards Argentina, because La Ninas does have at least some statistical basis there, more so than other areas, and then their problem would be dry.
I get kidded at work. I'm the weather geek or the weather nerd at work, and looking at that map this morning, it looks like because of that, Argentina is expected to stay dry.
And that would be a classic scenario, but it's also, again, where the coldest pocket is, and right now it's more central orientated than eastern, and that adjusts the upper level wind flow into such that keeps, it would increase the odds of them to be drier than average.
Switch gears here, go back to let's talk more NDAWN. We didn't hear, last year we heard a lot about the new inversion tool. Didn't hear so much about it this year. Is every station available to have it, or?
Every one of our stations has inversion capabilities. Again, a lot of our new stations this year are not online or on the app, but if you go to the cloud service, like I mentioned, we installed the station by Wales. All of our stations have a cloud service. say in Fargo, it's fargo.ndawn.org. Say our news station that's up in Wales, that's not online yet on our main website, all the data is available at wales.ndawn.org. That will redirect you to the real URL, which is a long, complicated one that you can bookmark for you. That will even tell you inversion or normal, per se on there, but on the app. But I think the reason we didn't hear so much this year was really is everyone's used to it. Because we've had the tool in place for a long time, everyone's been educated on it. I got a lot of inquiries about it. When something went down, trust me, I heard about it. And as I always tell people when they call me and somewhat complain, I go, hey, if I was you, I'd be angry with me too. I understand where you're coming from. We'll fix it as soon as we can, type scenario. So I know it was heavily used. Sadly, I got some inquiries from lawyers and such to for the data on it. But we had fewer cases of drift this year. Can NDAWN take all of that credit? Absolutely not. But I think we can take part of it. And there was a lot of training on stuff. And really, the reality is, we'll see what happens with dicamba. If it will ever come back for 2021, what's going to happen. And the reality is, it's a political thing, so it might be determined by who wins the election this fall. Also on that, but I always tell people, even without dicamba, knowing when you're spraying even fungicide, it still is a return on investment. If the conditions aren't right and your fungicide is drifting over someplace, it's not going to do it's not the concern of dicamba, but it's wasted product for you. You didn't cover your crops like your sugar beets as well as you had wanted to. So it's still a very useful tool that's involved, even when non-dicamba products.
I think that's the biggest thing too, is we need to realize it's a tool.
Right. And again, it could be a return on investment tool. And in that inversion app is this thing that people ask me all the time, because it's not in the app as well as it should be, but that was a cost-saving thing, is this concept of delta T. And delta T is the temperature minus the dew point. And so really it gives you a much better aspect to what the atmospheric moisture content is rather than relative humidity. And so if that delta T is, it's a June day and you're spraying dicamba, say, on your soybeans, and that delta T is 15 or 16, what happens is most people didn't adjust their nozzle side. So really with that large delta T, the atmosphere is very dry. So what's coming out, being sprayed, a lot of it evaporates right away. And I mention that because let's go away from dicamba again. Again, the fungicide, you're spraying it, and you think you got a good coverage of fungicide, but because it was so dry, so much of that evaporated, you didn't cover, say, your sugar beets very well for Cercospora. Granted, in North Dakota and western Minnesota, we have to spray when we have to spray because it's just windy here, and there's days you just can't spray, and I don't care what the delta T. All I'm telling you is the delta T at least will give you an understanding, because I've had people, after I explain this to them, go to me and go, oh, just like this light bulb moment. They go, no wonder that one day I sprayed and I got such horrible coverage, and it was like I didn't do anything on that particular field, because he remembers that delta T was up like that 18. I go, yeah, everything was just evaporating, and you didn't really cover, so the plant could not absorb. The opposite is when the delta T is really high. So the plant, will have, especially when you're doing herbicides, is the plant will have a lot of moisture in it, so then the herbicide that's in there, the plant goes, just so I know you're not bothering me today, which in turn will build up a little bit of resistance on it. So that's why at the beginning, if the delta T is 0, 1, or 2, spraying is not really recommended, just because its odds are the leaves are really, really wet because the humidity is still very high. Then we have this range of about 4 to 14. That's the best from research. And then we have, it's 15, 16, 17. Again, it's getting a little too dry. And then once you get it, above 19, 20, especially in western North Dakota, well, delta T's in the 20, and they're trying to spray for fusarium. So much of it is just not getting a good coverage again. So that's a quick explanation to why that delta T in it. But the thing is, when you're drying this year, delta T still works. You'll notice this, anytime, if you read like Ken Hellevain's stuff from NDSU, he always recommends 40 degrees or higher. Well, why? One of the reasons is the atmosphere can hold so little moisture below that, so if you're trying to dry at 32, no matter what the relative humidity is, the delta T is going to be probably 1 or 2. And so you can use that and go, man, I just need to dry this down. Well, you're not getting anywhere, because you can turn your fans on all you want. Nothing's going to really happen. But by chance, if you get a day on the, when you want to dry down and it's like 45 and the delta T is 8, 2 thumbs up, turn the fans on, and you'll actually get something accomplished that day. So it can be used beyond spraying and even the winter for drying.
That's a good point. I guess I hadn't really thought about that, being able to get our crop to dry down, especially in the bins like that.
Right. And so that delta T, and it's something that I'd like to work with research, and so we'd have a chart, because again, delta T works so much better than relative humidity. Relative humidity is relative because of the temperature, but delta T really gives a much better tool for people to use once you learn that concept over relative humidity.
Okay, we talked about going into fall, through our winter. What's next spring looking like?
Oh, wow, these crazy 7-8 month forecasts. The thing with next spring is it depends on where you're at, because I'll be honest, I had some health issues last winter, and I did not speak as much as a lot of people would like. But my forecast for this summer was for above average temperatures. I had a lot of people about the corn, and I said, next summer to me looks such like a great corn year if we don't have an early frost, which you can't forecast, and we did, which really frustrated because it was looking so good until last week. But I said I'm very confident on the above average temperatures. Rainfall, I said I think most of the area is going to be dry, but there's going to be splotches where it's wet. It's just the way that it works. On June 20th, 21st, 22nd, Bismarck had their driest year on record to that point. Fargo was in the top 15 driest years on record. The only spot that was wet was up in Kitson County that got that big rain in June. 2 days before that, I had a number of farmers up there going, Daryl, man, is it dry up here. We have had nothing since last year's fall, no snow, we're bone dry. I go, hey, this rain system is looking really promising for you.
Boy, was it ever.
And then they got flooded.
Yeah.
But that was the only area. And so at the end of June, I had a lot of people that did hear my forecast. And I'm always flattered when people say this, because I get a lot of it on the opposite when I stink. They go, wow, Daryl, you weren't kidding about this dry summer. And they go, well, you don't get cocky in this business because the pattern has shifted. And it looks a little bit wet for the next several weeks, at least in some areas, but then we'll probably go back to dry, which in the Red River Valley never really happened. So the Red River Valley turned wet, and most of the rest of the state, especially east of Highway 281, they had like Williston, it was only, 42% of normal this summer? And that was with one day. They got from memory, 2 inches of rain. They hadn't had that Phoenix would have been wetter than them. I mean, it would have been a desert out there. It was just horrible. So it's one of those days. I got it right for 2/3 of the people. I got everyone right for the temperature, but I didn't get it right for everybody. So next spring, I think the Red River Valley will have more difficulties. If it's a classic El Nino and we get above average snow, well, then we have to melt that off. That will in turn make for a late spring. We might have some flooding. If it's more of a scenario where I think we'll be closer to average on both temperatures and snowfall, and not get that extra 20 inches of snow this winter, that would speed us up in the fall. But a lot of times, El Nino springs the next year, think of 2017. 2017 was a La Nina, post-La Nina spring, ended up being a very dry summer. That's a little bit more of the scenario that I'm leaning at, probably not quite exactly that, but on the low end. And the other thing is, if we don't get that extra 20 inches of snow, then I have much more positive about next spring than I do otherwise. But you have to remember this last winter, it was snowy if you included the October 12th storm. Yeah. But that's not winter. But otherwise, Fargo, this area, it wasn't only Fargo, November was phenomenally dry last year until the last day. And we got 10 inches of snow with an inch of rain in it. So the month finished exactly average. And then December, boring until the 27th, another big snowstorm. Those 2 snowstorms was that extra 20, 25 inches, but we still finished very close to average on snowfall, which is 50 inches in Fargo. I think we ended up about 53, 54. I should know, I'm the official snow measurer, and even I forget the exact numbers sometimes. So that's always the problem with spring forecasts comes down to one snowstorm. Because if the snowstorm goes from Sioux Falls to the Twin Cities, well, those farmers have to deal with it. We're all selfish people. But if it ends up over here, it completely changes your whole dynamic. And so that's why the Red River Valley would be a little bit more prone to that, because we had a little bit more moisture this fall than the rest of the state did. But I will, over the winter, be doing more examinations, especially once I get into October. I look at the next year's seasons, the cycles, things, a little bit more details. But that would just be a kind of a preliminary little peek to what I'm thinking.
Anybody have any questions for Daryl?
This is a little larger scale, but I'm just curious, with the increase of open water in the North Pole, is that changing any of the weather modeling that's going on?
Could you repeat about the extra what at the North Pole?
The extra open water that we see in the North Pole around that area, there seems to be more open water for a longer time during the year. Is that changing any of the weather modeling?
See, this is where I would differ with consensus on that. I don't think it has any impact. The thing is, we only really know about Arctic ice with any degree of knowledge since the mid-1950s. The 1970s. Before that, it's just stories and explorers and research vessels. There is very strong evidence. You have to remember our first nuclear submarine that the United States had in the 1950s surfaced at the North Pole and took a bunch of pictures. There was no ice there. It was wide open spaces, and it was a beautiful day. They sat on the ice, had a hot dog. I don't make that part up. But, and then back in the 1920s and 1930s, there's very strong evidence to suggest that the Arctic ice was similar to what it is today. So there's no denying that it's been lower, but it's been really stabilized for like the last 10 years. There's been very little increase or decrease. But these theories that it enhances, say, the polar jet and stuff, there's just no evidence to support that, because nothing has changed in that regards. And then the other thing is the ice content by Halloween, the whole Arctic Ocean will be covered with ice again. So then that water's not available for evaporation, and it should in turn not have any impact. So I understand to some degree what they're saying, but there's really no evidence. And you have to remember, modeling isn't science. I can make a model of anything. I can input the numbers I want to get the end result. So I'm a purist. I don't consider modeling science. I'm not a person that, I'm not a phone forecaster. Everything on your phone now is pretty much the same from wherever you get it, because it's all computer-based. I still do things with my hands and look at maps and stuff. So I don't know if they're right or if I'm wrong. I don't see any evidence that anything different has occurred.
Thank you, Daryl. I was hoping for that answer.
Any other questions before we wrap up here? This time goes by fast.
Well, if you guys let me out of here without any tough questions, that's good. Because when I'm at farm shows during this segment of Q&A at the end, I always tell people, now this is the time frame that I get myself in a lot of trouble. And so if I can sneak out,
I've got one.
I'm always happy.
We've been hearing a lot about, because we don't have as many airplanes flying intercontinentally and overseas and stuff. I've been hearing some talk about that we don't get the weather data from those airplanes. Is that having an impact on some of our forecasting?
Yes, is a one-word answer, most definitely. Especially over the Pacific. The Pacific, again, is 38% of the planet. So granted, it's both north and south. So we'll divide it in two and just round it to 20%. Almost all of our weather comes from that 20% to North America. And we have no balloon launch capabilities there. All of the data, especially in the last 10, 15 years, some of the improvements in computer modeling is associated with more data. And so without those flights coming in and out, there's not quite as much. The thing is, it only sometimes takes one or two airplanes to get you the data, and that's still occurring. It would be nice to have it. I've read, not really research per se, that's been peer reviewed, the fancy word that doesn't mean much anymore, about how, yeah, it's had an impact, but we're getting some flights over and doing it on it. The nearest balloon launching to us is Aberdeen and Bismarck. I really wish there was one in the Red River Valley. There never will be. It's an expensive thing. And it's always that virtual data. Now, the models will tell you, yeah, but that's virtual. Again, it's not real over us on it. That would be really, really nice. But I think that it's probably decreased how good it is a little bit, to what degree. No, I think the good news is, that will all be changing itself over the course of the next year, and life goes back to normal again, and we'll get it. But I think, it's just, I'd say this a little bit more of an opinion than a factual statement, is, I think it's had at least a small impact on the accuracy.
Sure.
But again, humans are supposed to do the forecasting, not computers.
True. Very good. Daryl, I appreciate the time we had a chance to spend with you this morning. Thank you much for coming on.
Oh, I appreciate being out. And again, man, it is nice to be sitting in front and actually seeing humans again outside of my, I've spent, before COVID-19, I had spent a lot of time in front of a computer with conference calls on Zoom or Skype or FaceTime, just because of my position and dealing with national things. But I really miss just being out, and it's nice to be out again.
Thank you much. Let's give Daryl a hand. Just a reminder, the presentation we just had will be available online. Just go to rrfn.com. You can click on the big iron tab, and you'll be able to scroll down and find any one of our seminars that we've done. Take a cap along with you if you want to go. We've got some nice bison colored ones over there, and we've got some red ones and some green ones, and some, I think they're called mustard, I think. But
And
anyway,
now you're making us all hungry
grab
for
a cap.
lunch.
My goal is not to carry them back home, okay? So thank you all for coming. Appreciate it. Thank you much.